Good afternoon and most welcome to 1062 of the series. And by inspiration, or thanks for the tip, Kalle, I'm going to speak about Roland Barthes and especially Empire of the Sign. But we start with a brief introduction to the thinking of Roland Barthes. That's clever. See, fingers crossed. This goes to show you need to plan in advance. Science into science. How metaphors can act on several levels simultaneously. Well, lecture inspired by the Empire of Science by Roland Barthes. Let me just give an example here. Once upon a time, Che Guevara, the Argentinian/Cuban revolutionary friend of Fidel and Raul Castro, became a very overt symbol for revolution, first among communists. And then I think that thanks to good photography and graphic representation and his unshaven face and uncut features, he became later iconic for all sorts of revolution, not only communists. And he seemed to adhere to the new times, coming of a new era, a new epoch. So he served a purpose as a sign for revolution, showing the direction. And first it was mostly like posters, and later it became these pins you put on your shirt, whatever it might be, and it was taken over by the hippie movement and came to be a more general sign. No longer was it just about revolution in the sense of political revolution for economic inequality and freedom for the masses against tyrants. Now it, in a more general way, represented revolutionaryism, or being contra the previous order, the idea of conservatism contra the idea of something new. It's a sort of a generalization of the term. But later on, most interesting, the face, the beard, and the colors of, especially the graphics signature, became so potent that it became something, oddly enough, for t-shirts makers and pin makers and the makers of jewelry and posters and art even. Somewhere it became a mass product. And this is what Roland Barthes calls the event of a myth. He had turned from an actual sign or an actual causal agent to a whole different type of causal agent. One that was a bit more internal and served its purpose more on an individual level, no longer an actual movement. And I would say that is quite different, and this is the different levels. Of course, to some it will still ring a bell of communism and disruption of proper governance. But to most, and this is also an interesting point for Roland Barthes, is that the causal effect of the sign is now quite different. It doesn't have the same purpose in the world. It does have a purpose, but it is now distinctly different. He also calls this partaking in the events on a second level. The level of the myth. It is still a sign, but what it partakes is quite different. The modus, one could say, of the sign has changed, or the aspect. And it's very important here to understand, despite what many postmodernists would claim, that it has lost its meaning. It has acquired a different meaning, and instead of meaning, one could say it has a now another cause and effect in the world. I think that is most interesting, and it is an odd but very serious insight from Roland Barthes that here comes into the fore. And it has a personal level in Roland Barthes' own journey towards this understanding, towards his establishment of a new philosophy or a new thinking. And this is the next paragraph here. Roland Barthes was from the beginning sternly established within semiotics. This is the thinking of Saussure and other semiotics. He was well studied within the subject, and he wanted to go to Japan to study science. That was the expressed purpose for the journey. He wanted to see science within the different cultural aspects of Japan, calling them still at this point cultural aspects, like the kabuki theater, the no drama, doings or actions like shodo, works of art, hobby like origami, bonsai, and so forth. And this very quickly, which I think is very interesting, he must have been a perceptive guy, made him sort of change his mind, change his demeanor, his attitude, and he gave up this verticalness that I mentioned a couple lectures ago, where on top you have the signifier and underneath you have the signified, and it is all difference, only difference, and the signs are in themselves completely arbitrary, and the signifieds are also arbitrary. He came to an understanding that none of these were really arbitrarily. They were not lacking in causal effect. Could have been possibly a degree of causal effect, but I don't think he would agree with that either. I think it's a good start to see his coming understanding in this trip in the 60s to Japan was that there were many different levels going on at the same time. I think that is a good start. and he gave up semiotics, or he sort of entered in semiotics and changed it from within in a most interesting way. I think this is quite unusual, especially taking the short span of time he spent there. So it had a quite decisive effect in his life. He means that signs, or whatever you call them, these representations, are complete and full in themselves. They do not need anything added to them. They are not in want of something extra, an explanation, or even a meaning. They are in themselves there. The Western way of doing it is putting on a decorum, or putting it into a system of meanings, referrals, representations, directions, and so forth. And he sees it rather like these things already have their meaning in the world, and somehow there is no difference in the internal meaning and something that could be an exterior meaning. And I would say Roland's book on Japan belongs to the same genre as, for instance, Swift's Gulliver's Travel, or why not Voltaire's Candide. And this is something that Roland Barthes himself signals. In these genres, travelers go to a foreign country, which is largely mythical, fictional, fantastic, reflect on that country's institutions, and casting light on the writer's own. It might be a strange assertion. Japan is a real place, and Barthes really went there. But the book is more an examination of Western thought about Japan, and especially about Zen, and about Western thought itself, about how Western thought and language is ceaselessly spinning out of sign system, is in fact an infinite supplement of supernumerary signifiers, which form the basis of Western consciousness. In Empire of Signs, Barthes imagines the possibility of this ceaseless chapter ceasing. He imagines a system of emptiness, which he sees in Japanese or in Zen culture. It's a rather short book, and it handles different aspects of Japan, like food, chopsticks, calligraphy, pachinko, the haiku, the eyelid, and so on. Barthes' meditations are spot on, accurate, imaginative, rounded in reality, and beautifully expressed. Yeah, it is a bit of a beauty. His way of expressing himself even goes over to the English translation, and I read the book like 3-4 times. I really think it's a delight. One could say that this book is a kind of a dialogue between East and West, and it does bear similarities to the book I mentioned earlier on, Gespräche von Gespräche, where an inquirer spoke to an interlocutor, a Japanese book by Heidegger, and it shows how Western thinking sort of can expound Japanese thinking, but at the same time reveals the Western thinking search for meaning, reference, and so forth. One could say a Frenchman, unless he is abroad, cannot classify French faces. Doubtless he perceives faces in common, but the abstraction of these repeated faces, which is the class to which they belong, escapes him. This I mentioned before, 80 lectures ago, when I spoke about face space, that to understand how a face looks, we need to have the general face, and then we need the extremes. And that could be hard to do if you want to identify a French face when you are in France. But you could, however, of course, identify individual faces. That is still something absolutely possible. The first chapter is called The Breach of Meaning, and it shows the deceptive easiness of haiku, that is intelligible, but appears to mean nothing, while that is nothing beyond itself. It presents its meaning simply. And in contrast to Western poetry, which demands a chiseled thought, the haiku allows one to be trivial, short and ordinary. The Western poetry can be said to have unavoidably two systems of meaning: the symbol, the metaphor, and reasoning, the syllogism. For a Western reader, the haiku is attracted to one or other of these two signification systems. That is, two systems are, on one hand, the symbol, the metaphor, and on the other hand, the reasoning, the syllogism. Let's look at it this way. First, we assign the haiku a poetic meaning. In Western literature, poetic is a symbol of the ineffable, the inexpressible. In this poetic meaning, everything in the haiku becomes symbolic or metaphorical. Please do compare when we read the Bible today, for instance. We see it, most of the things, as symbolic or metaphorically. Second, we see the three lines. Haiku has 3 lines as a syllogism: rise, suspense, and conclusion. If we renounce both these systems, commentary becomes impossible. To comment on the haiku means simply to repeat it. Yeah, it is quite different. Western methods of interpretation fail the haiku. The West moistens everything with meaning, like an authoritarian religion which imposes baptism on entire peoples. The work of reading which is attached to it is to suspend language, not to provoke it. Let's listen to an haiku here from the book and also from Basho. How admirable he is! Who does not think life is ephemeral when he sees a flash of lightning? Basho. Chapter 2, a little shorthand: exemption from meaning. The Buddhist syllogism contains 4 propositions. This is A, this is not A, this is both A and not A, this is neither not A, nor and not A, nor an A, or nor both. This is the obstructed meaning and impossible paradigm. That is para-consistent logic. In this way, Zen wages a war against meaning. For example, the sixth patriarch recommended his students to give the following answer. If questioning you, someone interrogates you about non-being, answer with being. If you are questioned about the ordinary man, answer by speaking about the master. The Patriarch's recommended response is designed to disrupt the paradigms of question and answer / language, and therefore to imperil the search for meaning. Zen makes the mere mechanism of meaning apparent. It comes to fore. It goes into the Lichtung, so to speak. The haiku is an attempt to attain a flat language, a language with no layers of meaning. Barth calls this in the book a lamination of meaning, a first level signifier, a signifier which is matte. All we can do with this matte signifier is scrutinize, not solve it. Zen and haiku are praxis designed to hold language. Satori or nirvana is a suspension of the constant inner language of consciousness. Because language sums up other languages to penetrate meaning. Secondary signifiers, thoughts of thoughts, Zen perceives of this kind of jamming or noise, you could call it. The abolition of secondary thought is one of the aims of the haiku. The haiku attacks the symbol as a semantic operation by refusing the possibility of a secondary language. That secondary language is the language of explaining or understanding. It does this by measuring language, a concept which is inconceivable to the Western mind, because the Western mind always tries to make signifier and signified disproportionate, by saying a little with many words or by saying a lot with few words. The haiku, on the other hand, is an adequation of signifier and signify, as suppression of margins, smudges and interstices. In the haiku, signified and signifier are measured. Get the measure of something is also meant by this. And then he goes into the practice of saying a haiku twice. Saying it once is to give the meaning of surprise to its sudden perfect appearance. Saying it more than twice is to simulate profundity, to postulate that meaning can be discovered in it. Saying it twice is an echo, neither singular nor profound. There is a moment when language ceases, and it is this echoless breach which institutes at once the truth of Zen and the form, brief and empty, of the haiku. And perhaps what Zen calls satori is no more than a panic suspension of language, the blank which erases in us the reign of the codes, the breach of the internal recitation. Codes is actually a Barthesian term, meaning the reference discourse which underlie Western literature. Basically here it means any kind of secondary thoughts. The echo merely draws a line under the nullity of meaning. I come by the mountain path. Ah, this is exquisite. A violet, also by Basho. I saw the first snow. That morning I forgot to wash my face. Unknown author. Third, the incident. Western art transforms the impression into description. In the West description, a Western genre is equivalent of contemplation. Two kinds of contemplation. Forms of divinity, Loyola and evangelical narrative episodes. In the haiku, there is no metaphysics centered around a subject or around a god. The haiku is centered around the Zen character Mu, which means nothing or nothingness, an apprehension of the thing as an event, not as substance. The haiku is centered on what happens to language rather than what happens to the subject producing or receiving the language. The haiku does not describe something that will be counterintuitive until one realizes what Barthes meant by describe, namely, the relationship between the sign and the signified. According to Barthes, this relationship doesn't exist in the haiku. In the haiku, language has no referent, is the essence of appearance and an untenable movement. It is language degree 0. Barthes calls this later in the essay an escheat of signification. It presents language as a category, as a painting, as a miniature painting. The order and dispersion of haiku in anthology is another text. On the one hand, there is a plethora, on the other, brevity. This creates a dust of fragmentary events with no direction or termination. The haiku and the self is nothing but the sight of reading, timeless. The haiku reflects the self. For example, in the Huayan doctrine, that is one of the tenets of Mahayana Buddhism, the origin, one can say, of Zen, a haiku is a jewel which reflects all the other jewels in a kind of irradiation, but one with no center. Roland Barthes also take up the Japanese town. It does not, like the Greek town, have a center. It's centeredless. It's decentered constantly. There is not a statue in the middle of the Japanese town. It's usually sheer emptiness. In the West, the analogy of this is the dictionary, a play of reflections without origin. Reflection in the West, the mirror reflects the self. In the East, a mirror reflects nothingness. It is empty. This can be applied to everything which happens in the street of Japan. The streets are full of incidents which a Westerner can only read in the way he reads a haiku. But the ability to create haiku is denied the Westerner because of the way his consciousness is founded in language and his concept of language as a system generating secondary languages. The incident observed in the street do not have anything picturesque about them, nor do they have anything novelistic about them. Novelistic means they do not contribute to the chatter which would make them descriptions or narratives. The incidents of the street present a rectitude of line, a stroke, a gesture, the graphic nature of Japanese life, writing alla prima. And alla prima means putting the paint directly on wet and not waiting for the different layers or the laminations to build a solid foundation, dry up, and then you put the next layer. The line does not express, but causes to exist. There can be no hesitation, no regret, no trial and error in the stroke of the brush. These gestures do not refer back to the self. There is no self-sufficiency, only graphism. The haiku is time without subject. Reading has no other self than all the haikus, of which this self, by infinite refraction, is never anything but the sight of reading. The haiku reminds us of what has never happened to us. In it we recognize a repetition without origin, an event without cause, a memory without person, a language without moorings. The old pond. A frog jumps into the water. Oh, the sound of the water. Once more was Basho. 4. Let's continue with the haiku. The purpose of haiku is to achieve exemption from meaning, something that is impossible in Western literature, which contests meaning only by making it incomprehensible. The haiku resists commentary, and it's this commentary which is the most ordinary exercise of our consciousness. The haiku does not instruct, express, divert. It serves none of the purposes usually attributed to literature, due to its insignificance and due to the way it resists finality. The haiku is written just to write. It doesn't have any ornament, it's nothing extra. Doesn't have a supplement of meaning, explanation, or understanding. In Western literary science there are two basic functions which are well known: description and definition. And again, our Barth is here using describe in a special sense. Embellish with signification, with moralities committed as indices to revelation of a truth or a sentiment. The haiku thus resists both of these. The haiku does not describe in the sense of giving meaning to reality. The haiku does not define except only in the sense of giving a gesture, but this gesture is only an efflorescence of the object. The haiku only designates, it has no vibration or recurrence. It says, is that, or is that, it's so, or even just so, like in the poem we just heard, which said, ah. It is like the flash of a photo one takes very carefully, but with no film in the camera. I think that's great. The haiku is stripped of any mediation of knowledge, of possession, of nomination. It is like a child pointing at something and saying, that. The haiku's task is to achieve exemption from meaning with a perfectly readily discourse, a contradiction that is actually denied to Western art, which can contest meaning only by rendering its discourse incomprehensible. The haiku is a faint gash inscribed upon time. Nothing special, says the haiku, in accordance with the spirit of Zen. Nothing special has been acquired. The world's stone has been cast for nothing, neither waste nor flow of meaning. Full moon, and on the matting the shadow of a pine tree. In the fisherman's house the smell of dried fish and heat. The winter's wind blows, the cat's eyes blink. Anonymous. Meaning infuses everything we in the West partake in, whether it's listening to the friend's voice or the reading of the text that automatically seem to fall into the pit of meanings or centeredness, where we always already have a second language for everything. First a thought, and then a thought about the thought. First we have a thinking, and then we have an explanation for that thinking. We are ruminating, we are regurgitating. Ian McGilchrist, in a video, an interview by a Spanish physicist turned into neurologist, speaking about meaning giving and how that affects our thinking in the West. And if you in the test put up the question, what is the similarity or the likeness between a meter and a yard? And you answer, things to measure things with, a function that is, you will only get half a point. But if you instead take the second language role and say, these are different measurements, different kinds of measure in itself, almost like putting the Greek tha, the definite article, on it, you get a full score. And this tendency, I would say the tha is a meaning giver in itself. It's the definite article in Greek. The tha helps us to sort of fall into the meaning trap. It gives everything a definite meaning. It's no longer meaning, it's the meaning. It's no longer poetry, it's the poetry. It's this the that also have this, I think it's often got confused with proper abstraction, and I think today that's the most common. Put the on something, make it general, and then you have abstraction. I don't think so. I think it's the Western tendency for a thinking that is no longer thinking by itself, no longer a function, no longer acting. It is like you look at what you are doing instead of doing it. And if you say that a yard and a meter are things you measure things with, which is actually the original meaning of both of them, obviously, and instead say they are different measures, like they are meters somewhere else and yards somewhere else, and all of a sudden you're taking it out of its purpose, its cause and effect. I take a yardstick, I measure something, that is still a cause and effect. And the same goes with the sign. I would not say that the image, the icon, the pin or the t-shirt of Che Guevara has lost its meaning. No, It's meaning on another level. It still partakes in the world. And I think the tendency, if you have a second language, is that you leave for some other place. I don't know where this place is situated. It's somewhere else. And this being somewhere else, this is what takes away the directedness of the haiku. Takes away the possibility of directly perceiving it for what it is. It is poetry, not the poetry. It is what it is. It doesn't have a secondary meaning. And by being left to its own device, it can stand out. It can say things. And I would say, only by stop meaning giving can you access the world. Meaning giving somehow is the abandonment of the world, and you go into a self-made world of meanings, no longer participating in the cause and effect of the real world, which is of course is laminations, according to Barth, not a singular level world. And I think that is mighty interesting. It's like we have different spheres, and then they together perform the world. And they do remind me, these spheres, to some degree of the Matrushka, whose interpenetrativeness makes it inside and outside to become the same thing, and therefore being able to perform what it's supposed to do, acting in the world, not meaning something in the world. And what do we do if we perfectly lost all meaning in the world? Or, I mean, cause and effect in the world. What happens then? Well, then we need to designate more meaning to our world or to our thinking. And maybe the end point in that is I start claiming that I am Napoleon or the emperor. Why not? Speaking about empires, the Emperor of Portugalian, which is a magnificent novel, and that shows that the person that has lost his cause and effect in the world acquire other things, meanings, and often those meanings can be of spiritual nature, evangelical nature. It can also be that you try to put up an air like the Emperor of Portugalian and be something that is solely meaning and no longer have a cause and effect. Building up a second layer, and this second layer does not speak for itself. It's the rereading of the haiku. You need to be in that instant. It is in that instant it is happening. But that instant does not take away the past or the future. On the very contrary, it reinforces it. Because future and past are part of the cause and effect. I don't know if this last made sense. It did to me though. I put some links in here and also the video, and I'm looking for something in the video. Please have a look, see what you can find out. I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye for now. Is this the world, or are these things meaning solely?